Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening for those who are joining us. On behalf of the Anti-Racism Initiative Group working actually in the context of G20 Interfaith Forum, we are honored and humbled actually to welcome each one of you, especially our distinguished panelists. We welcome and acknowledge the persons who have tirelessly worked to make this conversation a reality. Jim, certainly our gratitude goes to you for bringing together this distinguished panel of people who have not just studied the experience of Indigenous people, but who are insiders themselves. Our world has been facing several reckonings. One of those reckonings is what this webinar will be all about. First people, first racism. A discussion with First Nation and Indigenous people. We are deeply grateful you have accepted to contribute to this conversation and to reframing for our generation what our world needs today. Racism is a cross-cutting issue for the IF20 and the G20 comprehensively, especially in the G20's pursuit of full compliance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Overall, a humanity, human and humane, in solidarity in the affirmation of the full humanity of every person, full human dignity, and full human right accessible to all. This unique space today could not be neglected. It is a place of restoration, actually, multifaceted work of restoration essential to achieve healing and reconciliation. So we are deeply grateful to all the panelists and all who will be contributing to this conversation and help advance, move forward for the healing of our world. So the Anti-Racism Initiative in the context of the IF20 and G20 Interfaith Forum, we are deeply honored again and grateful. Thank you to Christina for moderating, and thank you for our president, Cole Durham, who has also facilitated, and the whole team who have worked to make this a reality. Thank you very much, and my deep appreciation. Christina.
Thank you, Ganun, for leading us on this important journey through our new anti-racism initiative. And to start us off, I would actually like to invite from our Seneca Nation, Janos, who's going to start us off on this journey of healing and respect and listening to one another. She is the language director, and she will be giving us a blessing in both Seneca and English and translating that for us. Please, Janos.
I'm thankful you are all well. I'm going to give you a bit of an encouragement speech. We often use that to put a good tone on meetings that we might have, especially when we have difficult things to discuss. And dogas deo daweni nagan ohetki tioins aguego. Guahe sungwa janok to on hawe on ni gay ni wait doggy hadion yaki no a son de yon kinyat ni dog. Nikayo ni ogwenyo scanot do no donyo hadewani segi hadewa sondege heodo. Ne haikwa hawe on hade dwada no kwa ganyo de yongwada de yongwada weni ne itino ayuinzide. And da ona and wajano ni then what town yo ni oiwa state. Ne guana ne gan hat yagon and wajet duck. First people speaking there. It is true, the great sickness continues to move about all over the earth, but our Creator intended that the four heavenly beings continue to protect us. For this reason, we can have peace in our minds every day and every night. He also intended that we love one another while walking about our Mother Earth. So now we will carefully talk about this heavy matter. However, it is necessary we will use a good mind. That is all. Daniho.
So my name is Christina Tobia-Nahi, and I am the Director of Communications and Public Affairs for Islamic Relief USA. And I just wanted to note I'm not there in a professional capacity, so anything I might say today is of personal note. And my interest in this particular area comes because my formative years were spent in Hawaii. I actually went to high school and university there and studied Hawaiian, Asian, and Pacific studies. And those of you who have been following the news these past couple of weeks obviously have seen the advocacy of the AAPI community, the Asian American Pacific Islanders, with the violence and the hate crimes that have come to the fore. What we haven't talked so much about, though, is these Indigenous communities, such as those from the lands of Hawaii and others. Those peoples who were displaced from their lands, who lost their language, who lost their cultures, who lost their identities, because they were forced assimilated. And we're going to talk about that more in these personal stories and narratives, how some of this trauma, intergenerational, has transpired, and yet how we can come out on the other side through healing. Just today, actually, if you follow the Washington Post, there was an article about vaccinations, and I will put it in the chats, and it was how the native populations were vaccinated against smallpox, but not in order to protect these peoples, but it was actually in order then to protect those in the lands around them and to displace them off of these lands. And I will share that in the chat, but it is a history that we've seen over and over. It's the same that you will see on the Australian continent if you look at the Aborigines. Again, that forced displacement, that forced assimilation into schools where children were not allowed to use their native languages. If you haven't seen the movie, The Rabbit Proof Fence, I highly recommend it. And just a couple of years ago, the last young girl that was part of that migration back, escaping one of those schools and looking for her roots. She only recently passed away in the age of, she was in her 90s. So, you know, this is a story we've seen across different continents, and it's a story that we can't forget. Here today, we want to give a chance to these illustrious speakers who have, you know, made their mark in their spaces, both in Canada and our Northern Territories and here in the US, through their advocacy, through their political participation, through their civic engagement, through teaching the next generation. They all have incredible stories that we would like to ask them to share in their own voices and in their own words. Just today, as we know, the George Floyd trial is starting. BLM and the Black Lives Movement, again, you know, like that of the AAPI community, has been in the news these past few months. But there were other communities that were here before that have experienced racism, and we want to make sure that they are heard. And so you have all seen on the flyer, the illustrious speakers that I'm about to introduce. I will only say their names and titles as I bring them on one-on-one. I would like them to introduce themselves, like Janos, if they would like to do that in their native language, please do so. And in recognition of that also, I'm putting in the chat, CNN recently has done a story about this amazing mapping that is being done where you can go in and click, and I've just put it in there, and find out where you yourself are situated and on whose land you sit, and you can honor that. And so that's what we're doing today, is we're honoring these people, we're honoring their lands, and we're honoring their languages. So without further ado, I would like to kick this off with our first speaker, who is actually a member of parliament in Canada. Her name is Leah Gazan, and she is a member of parliament for the Winnipeg Centre. And she's also a driving force behind the Indigenous Human Rights Act in Canada and the #WeCare campaign to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. And we will come back to that topic a little later because it is, as we know, International Women's History Month, and we want to pick up some of those topics. But right now, I would ask her to speak, and she is a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota Nation. Please, Leah.
Well, first, I'd like to start out by saying how honored I am. I come to you today on Treaty 1 territory, homeland of the Métis Nation. Boju Heyushka Washdewi, Red Sky Woman, Indigenous, Makwa Dodem, Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, Treaty 4 territory, and it's located in Saskatchewan, and my given name is Leah Gazan. So I have a very interesting history, in fact. You know, I come from a cross-cultural background. My father was a Holocaust survivor from Holland, only surviving child after the war. There was 5 survivors in total, my father being one of them. And my mother was an Indigenous Chinese woman from Wood Mountain Lakota Nation, Saskatchewan. We're actually the only Lakota nation in Canada, and we actually have our community on the state side, which is Cheyenne River. So I was asked to talk a little bit about my history and the impacts of genocide and how it's impacted my life. And I can tell you, coming from genocides from different parts of the world is an interesting experience. Certainly on my father's side, having a total erasure of family and community as a result of genocide that occurred in the Holocaust, but also my mother's side as a result of Indian Act policies at the time. My mother was a profoundly strong woman, ended up on the streets at age 5 after my grandmother was unable to look after her. She was 12 years old herself when she began looking after herself. You know, grew up in child welfare between the age of 5 and 18, aged out of care. And at the time, and it's still very much like that, they said, Marjorie, you're 18, you're on your own. She had nowhere to go, but she had a brilliant mind, and she ended up becoming an award-winning psychiatric nurse and changing mental health legislation in the province of Saskatchewan in Canada at the time. So when my parents met, one of the things that bonded them together, because they actually met and married in 6 weeks, it was pretty intense, is that they didn't have to talk about the impacts of discrimination. They didn't have to explain to each other what racism is or how genocide impacted both of them, you know, ending up really growing up virtually alone in the world. What it meant for me as a descendant, of course, that you learn your culture from your family and community. My family, my Indigenous family, is really the only family I've had connection with. And so in terms of cultural orientation, I grew up connected to my community, fortunately, starting at about the age of 13 when our family reunified, a family that was totally disrupted by violent colonialism in Wood Mountain. And, you know, we talk about loss and erasure, but I think it's important to talk about the resiliency one has through your blood memory. You know, I'm a descendant of Sitting Bull, you know, a revered leader. You know, in the amongst Indigenous peoples, I think not just in Canada or the States, but throughout the world. I come from a line of people who, in spite of all attempts to erase our existence, that we are still here, that we still rise, that we still, in spite of all the attempts to dispossess us of our lands, that we still are on the front lines defending our human rights. And I would say, particularly at this point in history, it's young people and Indigenous women who are on the front lines defending our lands and territories. Because when you dispossess people of their lands, you dispossess them of their power. And when I talk about power, I'm also talking about identity and the ability to situate yourself in place and space. And I know even as a young person, when, you know, returning to my lands at 13, my own homelands at 13, it was like I had never left, because the spirit of our lands is still very much alive. And when I met my relatives for the first time, relatives that had been totally disrupted through violent institutionalization through residential schools and child welfare, we felt as though we knew each other our whole lives. And so even though I do feel, I call it like trauma that we inherit through our blood memory, I wouldn't say that I don't have that. It's certainly very much real for me. I also carry the resilience of my ancestors, even my grandmother. You know, my grandmother was 12 when she was on her own. She was in residential school. At the time, it was the 30s. There was no human rights for Indigenous women when she had my mother. And in spite of all of that, she survived. And, you know, even looking back at my own history, trying to figure out how my grandmother could, you know, leave my mother on the streets, a mother who I adored so dearly, looking back to try and understand her, to reconcile my relationship with my grandmother, even though she wasn't here anymore, something that I did a few years ago. I'm going to go back a little bit. So a few years ago, when I was talking to my partner, who we're in the same room right now on the same panel, by the way, which is pretty funny, but back a few years ago, I was talking about my grandmother, and I called her my mother's mother. And I've always called her my mother's mother. And I don't know why I never heard that. But a few years ago, I heard that. I thought, wow, I call my grandmother my mother's mother. And I think for me, it really solidified that disconnect from family that happens, and how relationships become so messy through colonization. So I actually wrote a chapter about my grandmother and rooted her experience in the histories of Canada that were supported through violent legislation, and what led my grandmother to have no choice but to make the decisions that she made at the time. So I think, you know, when we're talking about racism, you know, even today, how to reconcile, I think as an Indigenous person, I've had to reconcile my own experience in my own community, but also looking outwards. I can say that, you know, racism is alive and well today. In Canada, as an Indigenous woman, I still, under the Indian Act, do not have the same rights as other women, let alone men. That there will never be reconciliation in the absence of justice. And if we truly are going to change things, if we are truly going to change things, then we have to look at the structures that are still in place that perpetuate inequality, that, for example, have resulted, particularly for Indigenous women, in heightened rates of violence and a crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit in this country. So I'm going to leave it at that. I know I only have 6 minutes. It's hard to take your whole weird history of very diverse history and put it in 6 minutes, but I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Leah. That was very powerful. And I think you've actually somewhat introduced our next speaker and your partner, who I'll bring up momentarily. But I think, you know, something that's important that you said, and I hope we can come back to later, is this kind of going backwards in order to move forwards. And I hope we'll be able to explore that a little bit more, because that will be part of, you know, the healing discussion. How do we take that forward? So our next speaker, also from our illustrious neighbor to the north in Canada, is Romeo Saganash. He was Quebec's first Indigenous member of Parliament. He is Cree. And something that I think is important, and that, you know, was brought up in our intro about bringing this back to the Sustainable Development Goals is Romeo spent 23 years, so much of his lifetime, helping to negotiate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I hope we will be able to hear a little bit more about that as well. Please, Romeo.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, it's always challenging to follow Leah whenever she makes a presentation on the same panel as I, but I'll do my best. I'll try my best. Nistem jak rytmadno nastawię się dziesię, kabidżuj sam je wyda, kabidżuj sam je gdzieś bet patsman, and tabaczem and date mungie, ujagon, jaim would mukke, kajisgats. Say tengan as sti, sad, jagon, which gantizi, jaim would man, good stand man, when I sti and me go get is yaim would man, mukken good stand. Dan is dicht, is a genochte man. Dan is het matsian, de Dutch, Ujagon, et I could become sweat. Memogni, sweat, Jano, Utebik. So thank you for that brief introduction. I just said in Cree how honored and privileged I feel to be participating on this panel. I know that racism is a subject that is sometimes difficult to address. So I'll try to do it from my own perspective and from my own experience from over the years. Like many Crees of my generation, I was born literally on the land under a tent. And I was born and raised in the bush in the boreal forest for the first 7 years of my life. So you can guess pretty well from that initial experience in life that the only language I heard for the first 7 years of my life and spoke was Cree. And those were the first 7 years of my life were probably the most enjoyable in my life, because it allowed me to understand the Cree way of life. It allowed me to understand also all of the animals, the land, the way of life of my people, and how everyone is expected to contribute to the thriving of the family, but also the community. Until, of course, like most people of my generation as well, I was taken away to residential school, where I spent the next decade of my life at the Latuk Residential School. Like most of my siblings, there were 14 of us. Most of us were taken away, kidnapped, and sent to residential school. And purposely, they divided all of the siblings into 4 or 5 different residential schools throughout Canada. Some were sent as far away as 2,500 kilometers from home, from their homeland. So I spent 10 years in that institution, which I often called a political incarceration, a cultural incarceration, a linguistic incarceration, because we weren't allowed to speak our language. We're taken away from our culture, our families, our territory, and political incarceration, because the only reason we were taken away was that we were Indigenous. So, like I said, I spent 10 years in that institution, and if we have an occasion at another time, perhaps we can talk in details about that. But when I was finally released after a decade, I promised myself 2 things. First, to return to the land, because I missed it so much after 10 years. And second of all, and I think most importantly perhaps, was to put effort and focus into reconciling with the people that put me away for 10 years. And that's been, I guess, my lifetime effort and to reconcile with the people that put me away for 10 years. And it wasn't easy. And I chose different paths along the way. First and foremost, I accidentally decided to go to law school. This was in 1986. And I graduated first Cree from Quebec to graduate from law school in 1989. Then I also accidentally stumbled upon the Cree ambassador to the UN in 1984. The Cree ambassador to the UN was an official position of the Cree Nation and the Cree people. And Ted Moses invited me that year, this is 1984, to accompany him to the United Nations. He said there's an important process that is set to begin, and it's going to be around the drafting and negotiation of a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples in the world. He said that very precisely, I remember his words. He said, "You don't have to do anything, Romeo. Just observe, see how it's done, and perhaps you may like this." And that's what happened. I liked it so much that for the next 23 years of that process, that lasted between 1984 to 2007, I went to Geneva every year to discuss, to debate, to negotiate, and to draft the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Very few of us Indigenous individuals can say, I was there for 23 years. I can say that. So it was an outstanding experience for me, given the fact that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is perhaps the longest discussed and the longest negotiated international human rights instrument in the history of the United Nations. It took us 23 years to get the General Assembly to finally adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in September of 2007. Obviously, it was a great day for us. I also accidentally, and this is something that I enjoy doing, I accidentally ended up as being elected to the House of Commons or the Parliament of Canada in 2011, where I continued this effort and attempt to reconcile with the people that put me away. So I was there between 2011 and 2019, sorry. So 8.5 years in that place, trying to, or attempting to fix some of the wrongs that have been taking place over the last 150 years or so. I just want to, I know my 6 minutes is coming up, so I just want to conclude here by saying, I think it is important for all of us when discussing racism and racial discrimination to be cognizant of the fact that there are different legal frameworks and instruments at our disposal to combat that sin. Of course, the international human rights instruments that exist in the UN system. In our constitution in Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Part 1 of our constitution, and Section 35 of Aboriginal and Treaty Rights in Part 2 of our constitution. We also have treaties in Canada. Treaties define who you are. Treaties define your status as nations and as people. And of course, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I was asked not too long ago on another panel, what was my favorite provision in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? And my answer was pretty straightforward. and automatic, I referred directly to the second preamble or paragraph of the UN Declaration, and I'll read it for your benefit. So preamble or paragraph 2 reads, affirming that Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples, while recognizing the right of all peoples to be different, to consider themselves different, and to be respected as such. That is perhaps the simplest proposition in the UN Declaration or any international human rights instrument. Probably the most simple proposition, but perhaps the hardest to respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Romeo. And I know, along with the other organizers of this panel who are on, are very honored and humbled to be amongst all of you who have spoken so far and those who are coming. We actually did have one more speaker from Canada who also came from a law background. Unfortunately, Claudette is not with us today, unless she has joined. She was ill over the weekend, and so we wish her much health in her recovery. But that being said, we are going to another speaker who also is a professor of law. So a number of you who have really understood the structures that be, and through that have worked within some of these structures to go into the profession of law. So I would like to introduce next Michalyn Steele, who is at BYU, who is actually our organizing host of this event today. She is a professor of law of federal Indian law, teaching federal Indian law evidence and civil rights. Notably also, she was a former counselor to the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of Interior. And so I am hoping also that she will be able to speak to us about the first, here in the U.S., the first Native American Indigenous woman who has now been appointed to the Department of Interior as a cabinet secretary, and how that's going to be formative and transformative. She is a member of the Seneca Nation, and I know that she is of the Bear Clan from a previous meeting. And so
Beaver.
Beaver, sorry, the Beaver Clan. And
It's okay.
we have two, our next one as well. So I invite you to take the microphone next.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers for including me and to my fellow panelists for joining today. And thank you in a particular way to Janos for the blessing and that she offered at the beginning. It is very touching to hear the Seneca language spoken. In our family, my family, I was born in Western New York. Our family lived on the Cattaraugus territory. And I know Janos is from a sister territory there, but like Romeo, my great grandmothers were taken to boarding school, and my grandmother went to boarding school and was punished for speaking her language. She retained the language as Romeo has done, but that was not transmitted to my mother's generation, unfortunately, nor to mine. Now, I know we'll look forward to hearing from Janos about her significant efforts to restore that language, but I think it's been interesting that my distinguished panelists have talked about how important the language is to retaining culture, and how the destruction of language is one of the instruments of a kind of cultural genocide. So as I said, I'm currently at BYU. We are situated on the traditional homelands of the Ute and Paiute and Shoshone people. And so in some ways, I was very touched by Leah's story, because I am like her in that these different heritages meet in me. my mother is Seneca, and my father has ancestry to England. They met at BYU in the 1960s because they are both members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the sponsoring institution of BYU. So although they share a religious heritage, they were my dad was from Idaho, and my mom was from New York. So we have that history of the the traditions that meet in one person, and having to have, in some ways walk in both worlds, and sharing the history of religious persecution on the one side, that the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints were sort of driven from wherever they tried to settle because of religious intolerance. And of course, the Indigenous peoples in the United States were certainly, and elsewhere, were certainly, the attempt was to drive them from their lands. I like the story. There's a man named Red Jacket who is a Seneca diplomat. Well, let me back up and say my grandmother used to say to me, we're not supposed to be here, but here we are. And I often thought she meant by that both where we are in New York. You probably didn't realize, many of you, that there are Indian tribes in the state of New York. Many Indian tribes were dispossessed of their land, and although the Seneca were certainly dispossessed of much of their land, there is a certain stubbornness of why we still have territories in New York. And that's part of what my grandma was teaching me when she would say, we're not supposed to be here. She also meant, I think, that it was not the plan in the United States that there would still be Indigenous people into the 20th and 21st century. The expectation is that the tribal people would be fully assimilated or they would disappear. That was the policy of the United States, the official policy, and the laws reflected that policy for generations. And so when my co-panelists talk about the resilience of Indigenous people and culture, I wrote a paper a couple of years ago called Indigenous Resilience, and it was about how in the resilience literature, what makes communities and individuals and institutions endure and bounce back when they suffer an assault. That there are lessons for all of our communities and institutions to be taken from the ways in which the Indigenous peoples have built resilience, and it hasn't been without tremendous cost, personal cost, and the laws of assimilation. President Theodore Roosevelt said that the law was intended as a pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass, and he meant the lands. They wanted to get at the lands, right? But it was, as Romeo's experience and Leah's experience and Janos and the others will demonstrate, it was a pulverizing engine on tribal families and communities and culture as well. That quest for sort of forced assimilation. It has had tremendous consequences. About 10 years ago or so, there was an adorable little girl who was doing her report for elementary school about the Indigenous people in her area. And she happened to be from Western New York. And so her dad, who was a friend of mine, had her call me to interview me. so to help with her report. And I don't know how it is in other countries, but in the United States, a lot of times what that means, whatever grade of elementary school, 5th grade or something, that they, 4th grade, when they start to, when they have a chance to study the Indigenous people in their region, their 3-week unit or whatever it is. That what they tend to do is sort of freeze Indigenous people in a historic era, and they don't always help them understand the contemporary identities. So anyway, this little girl called me, and she taught me this great lesson, because she said, when you were a Seneca Indian, what was that like? What did you eat? What did you wear? She said. And it helped me to understand that there is still this sort of ongoing quest to assimilate, that you somehow, if you are wearing a certain clothing and eating certain foods, in some ways that you are less Seneca or less Indigenous, right? And that constant endeavor to try to cling to your identity, and even to to step into the modern world fully as an Indigenous person. And so it's really important that the story emphasize, I think, that although so much was lost, that we have survived as Indigenous people, and that thanks to people who have worked on the international instruments like Romeo, and in the context of the of federal Indian law, so many champions who have worked to preserve the culture and work to insist upon the rights of Indigenous peoples as individuals and also as peoples, that we're still here. And in particular, in terms of sort of religious rights, one of the things I've been thinking about in my recent scholarship is the right to access sacred spaces. That because of the history of, in particular, the United States, where I study, and a series of broken treaties and the sort of insatiable quest for cheap land, that again and again, when the United States was in a position to make a choice, we, the United States, chose to take the benefit of the bargains and impose the costs of those bargains onto Indigenous people. And that continues to happen, particularly in the field of energy development now, where the particular costs in pollution and land seizures and risk get concentrated onto the vulnerable, while the many, in some ways, or the elite, reap the benefits of those kinds of things. And so I guess one of the things that I would think about is how we reverse that and start to concentrate some of the benefits of the projects that we undertake for Indigenous people, rather than concentrating the costs and the externalities of those projects. And that means, to me, we have in the United States monuments and territories set aside, parks, wilderness, and that a lot of times Indigenous people need access to those territories, which are owned and controlled by the federal government, in order to practice their, whatever you want to call it, their religion, their ongoing cultural, spiritual practices. And so there ought to be some special consideration for accessing those sacred sites, in my view, and efforts to reverse the damage that was done to culture through programs like saving languages that have been that are endangered. And so anyway, I guess law is one instrument of that, law and policy. That's where I have studied. But there are also just the goodwill of people. It's interesting to me that some of the worst policies and laws that have come about for Native people were advocated for by people who thought they were on the side of the Indigenous people, right? There were those who were, as Cole has said, malign, and who really wanted to harm or didn't care about. There was just sort of virulent racism, but there was also a racism of benevolence in some way that posed as benevolence, that advocated for policies that they thought would be best for the tribes without including the tribes, without inviting the Indigenous voices into the conversation. And so I guess that would be my hope for moving forward. And I think this conversation is one way to do that, to invite Indigenous voices into the conversation. And as I've said, I think there is much to be learned from the survival of Indigenous people, from the priorities in Indigenous culture in terms of sharing resources and caring for the vulnerable, and the other kinds of principles of culture that have enabled our survival to this date. So as my grandma says, we're not supposed to be here. We're here. There is such a thing as a Lakota and a Seneca and a Cree in the 21st century, and there will be going forward, despite the best efforts of those in charge, those with access to power, to ensure our disappearance. So with that, I thank you for inviting me to be part of the discussion and look forward to hearing from the fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Michalyn. And I think that discussion on the access to sacred spaces is really important. And as someone, again, who came from Hawaii, that's still very much an issue of prominence there, whether it's, the volcano and its eruptions and these very powerful traditional elements for them. And just in terms of, we've heard a lot about trauma and a lot of pain today, and a lot about residential schools, which is actually going to be a great segue into our last speaker. So Janos, who I'm, honored to also call a personal friend, was someone who studied with me at the School of Education at Harvard. And whereas I came to my studies through an interest having been in Hawaii and seeing a resurgence and a renaissance of charter schools and schools that were bringing back Indigenous language, because like so many of these stories we heard today, young people had been separated from their culture, from their roots, from their land, and most importantly, from their language, and were actually penalized for speaking their language. And as an oral tradition, when it's not written down and you're losing it through the generations, how do you bring it back? And for those who were the memories and the elders that kept it, how to bring it back. I want to introduce Janos, who, inspired me at the School of Education as someone that knew that she was going to take this Ivy education and go back to her lands, to the Seneca Nation, and teach the next generation. And so I would like to offer her up to present her story next. Please, Janos.
I'm thankful you are all well. Janos, Leah Gazan, Onondawaga ni Oyende, go get gay got cool. Ona Hagyot de Hawini Ohio, Nate Onondawaga. Hagato hate so Gio Guino, Hat de Winnie Segi and Gay he Nigawano. So my name is Janos. I'm also of the Beaver clan. I am Seneca. I currently live and work on the Allegheny territory, which is, as Michalyn stated, sister territory to where she grew up. Her family's territory is Cattaraugus territory, which is just about a 35 to 40-minute drive away. And again, that happened because of lovely colonization. We are separated, but still one nation. So sometimes we have to deal with interesting things in order to maintain our identities. I know we are running kind of a little bit short on time. So what I'm going to try to do is be very brief. But when I went to the Kennedy School, following the education school, I decided I needed to understand not just how institutions use education to either politically ignite a movement, but also how education can be used to kind of placate people, make them docile and perhaps not free thinking. Education is a powerful tool. You can use it to empower, but you can also use it to colonize. So I figured, well, if I really want to bring empowerment through education, I need to understand the nitty-gritty of policy making, lawmaking, and politics. So I decided to leave the fluffy, happy, let's empower the world school and go to the brutal school of the Kennedy School of Government, where I could learn the policy aspect, because it's not easy. The devil is truly in the details. Convincing entire groups of people from different walks of lives how to make policies that empower people on a true level is a very difficult thing, especially when there are such varied interests and actions that people think are important. So I followed up. I did, as she stated, intend to go home. So I'm very humbled today to be part of this and very honored because while you all did some great international-esque type work, I decided to bring it all back home. And I don't get as much glory back here, but I'm important to my little community. I really just want to see us be happy, be successful, and be sovereign. The sovereignty is huge. If you know Haudenosaunee people, Iroquois people always talk about sovereignty. That is huge. So in New York State, if you come here, you're going to see something Seneca, something Cayuga, something that reflects Onondaga that's going to be right in your face. We constantly fight directly with our governments, and we take that federal recognition and that federal relationship very seriously. That is something we're pretty feisty about, as it was alluded to by Ms. Steele. We are pretty stubborn people. We will fight for what we think is our innate right to be sovereign as a nation, as individuals. And we do have some issues, social, we have to overcome, but we are still here. We're still feisty, and we're still willing to fight. So that's all I'll say, so we can get into the fun discussion.
Thank you. Well, what an amazing group of speakers today. I'm sure everyone listening, applause virtually. I wish we could all be in person, but as we know, we are here in this virtual environment because of COVID. And as we know, the Native and Indigenous populations have been disproportionately affected. My own organization, was one of those that was called upon to assist FEMA early on the onset to deliver fresh drinking water to the Navajo Nation across Utah and some of the other bordering states, because washing hands, right, that was so fundamental in the early stages of keeping the disease at bay was not possible when there wasn't running water. Children out of school for many of you on here has been a priority. You're working at home, you've got your children at home, you're homeschooling. But what about, not only do you not have laptops, but you don't have electricity on, some of the nation lands. You don't have Wi-Fi, right, in some of these very rural and other areas. So these are like the things that we're facing are exponentially being faced by Native and Indigenous populations here in the US that we really need to be mindful of in these discussions. We've talked a lot about resiliency today, and I am opening up the chat for questions from the public. We want to make this interactive, as was stated at the beginning. You won't be able to unmute, but we will have the ability to ask questions. If you want to target them to a specific speaker, please do direct it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll open it up to the full panelists. But before we move on, I have the liberty of asking one last question, because as I mentioned at the forefront, we are still in the kind of last waning days of International Women's History Month. We don't want to forget the experience and the leadership of women all months of the year, but because this has been a recognized month, we obviously want to bring that to the fore today. We've heard that Indigenous and Native women have experienced violence at very high levels. It's often not recognized or persecuted. People get away with it. We've also, in a lot of these IFG20 and other kind of interfaith meetings in general, often had to come to them in talking about religion and tradition and unpack and dismantle patriarchy. And being that a lot of, our women folk here, well, we have a lot of women speakers, we're missing one sadly, but they also come from traditions that are more matrilineal. I wanted to just kind of throw that out in this space about being a woman particularly. So we've heard your stories individually, but if you could bring a little bit of the gender component as we do close out International Women's Month, about how we can protect better the women in these spaces. And then we'll also take it to the chat. So please start putting your questions in, and that's addressed to anyone.
I guess I'll take that one from a Canadian context. I think it's important that, at the time of invasion, it was noted by the colonists the power that women had in our nation. And there was a very deliberate attempt to particularly silence the voices of women in Canada through the Indian Act, as I indicated earlier on, where Indigenous women in this country, never mind having the same rights as men, don't even have the same rights as other women in real time. And there has been always a crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls, but particularly noted, since the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls in Canada, where they likened the current crisis to a genocide in this country. We have currently almost 5,000 women who have gone murdered or missing with little or no action. Since the pandemic, we had, a young woman who was shot by the Winnipeg police, Aisha Hudson, other Indigenous girls at the hands of authorities that are supposed to be there to protect us. In my very own riding, a woman was found deceased on the streets of Winnipeg in the freezing cold. And it's the same sort of violence that's being perpetrated against our Mother Earth. In Canada, some places, Muskrat Falls, Sightsee Dam, Wet'suwet'en territory, the same sort of violence that is perpetrated against our Mother Earth is being perpetrated against women and girls, particularly around these resource development projects, where we see heightened rates of violence, heightened rates of sexual exploitation, something that is not just true to Canada, but true globally. And, as I indicated before, it has been women that have been, in spite of this, have been on the front lines of resistance, even today, fighting against patriarchy, fighting against misogyny, fighting against the abuse of our beautiful Mother Earth. We have been, whether it is in Canada or across the globe, the United States, around the globe, on the front lines of this resistance. And I say that because even though there has been attempts to eradicate us, even though there has been a history of a hypersexualization of Indigenous women globally, that we are resilient and we are strong and we continue to rise in the face of such violence. So I want to leave it there because I know there's so many other questions, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Anyone else want to take on that one? Okay, barring that, but again, if anyone wants to jump in later to answer that one. We've had a couple of questions because this Obviously, as part of the G20 Interfaith, and we have a very diverse audience, we were able to see who signed up earlier or late last week and earlier today, really diverse across nations, across cultures, across religious spaces. There are a couple of questions coming in just around how Native and Indigenous communities and populations have been able to engage in this interfaith space, if at all, and how there could be better inclusion in that. So, for example, in Canada and in the US, are there any examples in these interfaith spaces of how to better lend support and voice in policymaking and otherwise?
I'll respond to that. Oh, sorry, Janice, were you unmuting? I'll be quick.
Okay, no problem.
Well, one example comes to mind most immediately, and that is a very current issue called Oak Flat in Arizona. It is a space that is sacred to the Apache nations. It is critical to their worship that they be able to perform ceremonies in that space and with the materials that are found there. This is one way in which Indigenous practice, spiritual practice, religion doesn't always fit neatly as a category here, but I mean religion, their faith, their practices, their beliefs, their sacred rites, etc. RITES and RIGHTS, that those for Indigenous people are often tied to specific localities. And the disruption of those spaces is the disruption of their ability to practice their religion. It's not like you can just take your belief and practice it elsewhere. The land, specific locations are integral to the practice. So Oak Flat is such a place. The United States is in process of transferring that to an international mining company. The mining will certainly disrupt the ability of the tribes to access, and it is federal land, right? The federal government claims it due to past treaties. We do find religious groups rallying in support of the tribe's right to access this place and participating in litigation to try to stop the transfer of this land to the mining company. And so, I saw just this week a brief that was filed on behalf of, Sikhs and Hindus and Muslims and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were all on the brief together in support of the tribe's interest in accessing this sacred space. And so that's just one example, but I'm eager to hear what Janos has to say.
I actually was going to give a little bit more of a historical take on it. If you wanted, one of our questions wanted a specific example of a religious group that kind of perpetuated a good direction for policy regarding Native peoples. If you want to study historically around this sometime in the 1700s, the Quakers actually helped the Senecas quite a bit when it came to translating and being a fair warning system if the people they were making treaties with, New York State, were being shady. they would be very clear. They would be very clear. And of course, it wasn't perfect. There was still, colonization going on, and Quakers wanted everybody to practice Christianity. But in terms of ensuring that the Native people in this area were not taken for everything, they actually did try to assist in those particular situations when it came to treaty signings. So that is one historical example that's pretty clear, but they're very specific to the place that, like was stated earlier. So the other thing you have to be very clear about is not all Native nations had good interactions with religious entities, because where I come from, the church ran a lot of boarding schools. They did a lot of mean things, even the Quakers, to punish children who wanted to be onwe. So they make them read the Bible until they memorize entire crazy links of verses for punishment because they wanted to show their culture identity. So it is a very tenuous line. You need to be aware of that. Even if you want to be helpful, many populations will be very hesitant if you say you have anything to do with Christianity. I'm just being very honest. On my territory, it's still kind of that way. Whereas others might be more open because their families practice Christianity. So just be mindful that there is still that pull and that seemingly negative historical connotation that many people are trying to work through still, but in some places it might be more evolved than others. But like I said, here on this territory, I can tell you it's still there. And one side doesn't always respect the other side, but we're getting closer. We're getting closer to that. But it can be very specific to family or, I don't know, for instance, people who attend the Longhouse ceremonies might not always see eye to eye with the people who are Indigenous on our territory, but go to church. So just be mindful of those things. Be very mindful when you step in to try to help, that you listen to all sides and you're aware of the historical context. I think that's extremely important if you want to be helpful.
Thank you. And we've had a couple more questions come in. Since we've talked a lot about sites and access to sacred sites today, there's a method called the time travel method, which a lot of the NGO community is starting to use in terms, well, actually a couple of our questions coming up are around healing and reparation. So the time travel method is being used by a lot of NGOs with communities that have experienced trauma. It's a way, this methodology, to create safe spaces for people to reflect and find a way forward to develop future heritage and future society. But it does encompass using stories and using local sites and by acknowledging peoples that were there before. So I guess, some of the questions are about, we talked a lot about today about looking back in order to move forward. So one of the questions is more general about what types of methodologies and techniques different communities are using within their own communities that they would recommend for other communities that want to help in that process. Then there is a question, and I'll just throw them both out so people can answer them both, that's more about reparations agreements and how they're providing financial compensation to survivors and recognition in the sense of apologies and whether that's enough and how to move forward. So just looking at methodologies, looking at apologies, looking at financial compensation, I think all of our panelists will have something to say on one or all of these issues.
I wouldn't mind speaking on, I think it's important to recognize that colonization is not over. In fact, what we are going through right now is neocolonialism. One only has to look at what happened in Standing Rock, some of the interactions with the Canadian RCMP in relation to ongoing land disputes, where I would argue that the privileges of corporations supersede often the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands, territories, and resources. I think that's important because we often talk about colonization as a thing of the past when in fact it is not. In Canada, right now, we have a bill that has been brought forward based on Romeo's former bill C-262 to see the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as having application in Canadian law. I think it's important to recognize that, I would say it's true on the state side, but also in Canada, that Indigenous peoples in real time are not afforded minimum human rights, access to clean drinking water, appropriate housing, food security, the right to live in dignity. And, so if you're going to talk about reconciliation, then I think a first step is noting these intentional and willful human rights violations, as was noted by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal recently, about Canada's failure to uphold the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling to immediately stop racially discriminating against First Nations children living on reserve. And I think, you know, if you don't have truth, you don't have reconciliation. And I think this is difficult. It's difficult to really look at yourselves honestly and then act. And there's really no excuse for it. You know, I've often said, you know, they found billions of dollars for big oil and bailing out corporations during the pandemic, yet, and they can build a pipeline from here to Timbuktu, but they can't figure out how to provide clean drinking water in First Nations communities. Or, you know, we've had a national action or a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and we still do not have a national action plan, and women and girls continue, and Two-Spirit continue to go missing and murdered without a trace. And so I think we need to have an honest discussion about it. I think the bright part of it is that now we're not alone anymore. I think, you know, particularly in Canada, since the Truth and Reconciliation report, you know, people are finally willing to look at the true history that has occurred in Canada and figure out a way to move better in a more positive way. And that includes the faith community, who has, you know, from my experience and somebody who grew up outside of the Christian faith or community, or any other faith besides, you know, traditional Indigenous spirituality, they have been good. They have been good allies in terms of honoring their truth and involvement and continued involvement in violence against Indigenous peoples and moving forward in a way that promotes peace and justice.
Please, I invite others because I think this is a really deep question and you all would have something to say on the topic. And if not, there was a question that came specifically for Romeo on someone who was interested in the next stages on the Indigenous Peoples Convention, if you could speak to that more directly.
Okay, I think that is an important question. As we all know, the UN Declaration was adopted by the General Assembly some 13 years ago, 14, in 2007. And yet there are very few national legislations that have been adopted to make sure that the human rights contained and enshrined in the UN Declaration are respected and upheld. I've tried that twice during my time as a member of Parliament. First time in 2013 and the second time after I got re-elected in 2015, to make sure that the UN Declaration is recognized as having application in our national laws, on our national laws. Many countries in Latin America, for instance, or many tribunals in Latin America, for instance, are using or referencing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to determine or interpret Indigenous people's rights in those countries. Belize, Colombia are just a few examples. Our Canadian courts have been referencing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as well in their rulings, and I think that's going to continue. We have presently a federal legislation before Parliament. It's in second reading debate right now, as well as jointly being studied in committee. I think that's going to help in setting up the stage for the next step. And the next step is going to be to develop this implementation plan in cooperation, in collaboration with Indigenous peoples in Canada. So I think that was what I attempted to do for 8.5 years. I'm glad that the present government of Canada is picking up on the work that I've done over the 8.5 years in Canada.
Thank you, Romeo. And I appreciate that you acknowledge that we haven't mentioned all of the Indigenous communities today. We had hoped actually to have on this panel some of our Southern neighbors as well. That didn't work out for logistical reasons. But I think it's important, and I think it's important also in the chat, a lot of communities that were Indigenous on their lands have, a few of them have spoken up about some of the trials and tribulations that they're facing as well. And it's important that we acknowledge all across the globe, the rape and pillage of lands and other. We haven't minimalized also, today, I hope, what's going on in the AAPI community and the Black Lives Matter trial starting today that we mentioned at the outset, but we really had wanted to step back and talk about those who, were here before, not those that came and yes, are experiencing discrimination, but the people who were here on the lands first. Just again, in Hawaii, the royal family there, for those who may have visited, and they visited as a vacation spot, and the beautiful beaches and the volcano and visiting the museums and the palace. Those were real places where people suffered. The royal family was, already cavorting with the royal families in Europe at that time and had those kinds of interactions before they were placed under house arrest in their own palace. These are the types of tragedies that we are talking about today. So we want to recognize and honor the loss that we've been talking about. I know we haven't had too many questions, and I know Ganoon, who opened us up, did have a couple of remarks that he wanted to make. So I wanted to pass it to him to do that. And then this is our last kind of call out. If you have questions for the group, please put them in the chat. And, we have only about 9 or 10 more minutes. And we do have some extra time because we did unfortunately not have one of our speakers. So we want to make it interactive for the audience. We don't just want you to be passively listening. Please, if you have a pressing question that you'd like to hear from someone, please put it in the chat. And meanwhile, Ganoon.
Okay, yes. I wanted to say that this really, everything that has been said has put me in a position to say that this has been a very, very humbling experience, a very humbling event. And the reminder just now that colonization is not over. I mean, just as we hear that, is a way of saying that regarding the pain, the suffering, the transgenerational trauma, that there is not enough intentional effort for the healing, but rather a perpetration of this injustice. If I may say, I was born in Senegal, West Africa, where and I lived in a place called Gorée Island, where they used to ship the slaves, basically. So I spent many years looking at slaveries. But what we are talking here is genocide. So it's something so deeply dramatic. And then the more I reflect and read and listen and remember, I remember, for example, when I was, 8 years old, my grandmother telling me about stories of relatives who have been who've been going in the field, abducted, never to be seen again. But to think that on this side of the ocean, there was deliberate genocide. Then but what is this all about? Then realizing that the root cause of the dehumanization of Indigenous people is connected to the inhumanity of the legitimization of dominance. And along, of course, with the legitimization of violence. And this dominance of, I mean, not just the pride of a person caught in internalized dominance, but also a matrix of domination, structurally speaking, institutionally speaking. And this is why when I heard again today that colonization is not over for Indigenous people, it is a reminder that we have a long way to go. But I believe this conversation and the efforts, whether in the context of the G20, the UN, or beyond, may take us to a better place. And that it's really about the soul of humanity that is at stake here. But I salute the resiliency, and the memory of the blood somewhat, that was mentioned. I'm deeply humbled from everything that I've heard from every person who has shared their deep felt experience. This is not just theory. So I just want to express my gratitude to every speaker here.
Thank you, Ganun. I think you speak on behalf of all of the committee who's organizing this series of events on healing, and we hope this is just the first of many. And in our closing time, we wanted to actually go back through and allow each of our speakers in the same order that we started to have, the last minute or two to give any kind of closing remarks or reflections. We also heard that Claudette may have joined us, or she's attempting to. She's feeling better, but she's having some power issues. We were speaking about that earlier about Wi-Fi. So if she's able to, we will allow her and honor her that time also. But Leah, if you would like to start us out towards our closing.
Well, I just want to say what an honor and privilege it's been to be here today with all of you. Certainly two powerful women and my partner, Romeo, that, although we have a long way to go, I want to reiterate that, we're still here. And, I've been involved on the front lines of these issues for pretty much my whole life. And I used to joke, during the siege of Ganazadage, and I was in solidarity on the front lines of the Manitoba legislative grounds, the province where I reside. The only allies besides Indigenous people were the people in the white van taking pictures of us. But things have changed, like as somebody who helped organize many of the events, certainly in my province during the Idle No More movement in Winnipeg, something shifted in Canada, I think, since the TRC, since Idle No More, where I see people of all walks of life joining together in solidarity, and even the joining of forces, Black Lives Matter, Idle No More, and other groups that believe in human rights, that want to see an end to systemic racism, that believe that all people should live in dignity, that believe that diversity isn't bad but should be celebrated. And so I'll end it there, and just once again thank you so much to all the panelists and everybody who organized it. It's been a wonderful time. Thank you.
Romeo, I saw you unmuted. You are next.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I also want to thank you for the invitation. I feel pretty honored to be on this very powerful panel. When I was born in the forest in northern Quebec, in the boreal forest of northern Quebec, some time ago now, I knew that throughout my life I will have to fight to be respected. And I still continue to, even at my age, closing in on 60 years old. So I just want to say that I was hoping, I started this morning by listening to the opening statements in the George Floyd case, and I should have should have avoided that, because I saw racism staring at me in a very, very scary way. But yet again, I knew that, and I regret, and I told this to my children not too long ago, I regret that the legacy that I'm leaving behind is still this fight to be recognized, to be recognized, to be different, and to be respected as such. It's so simple saying it that way, but it's still hard to this day. So, but I guess we still have to be there to continue the fight. And I knew from the outset it was going to be a long journey. Thank you.
Michalyn.
Yeah, thank you again. I guess a couple of thoughts in closing. We've talked about that colonization, that much of it was done sort of under the cloak of religion, in the name of religion in some ways. And I guess I would say a misguided understanding of religion. But I think that there are genuinely, especially in this gathering, people of literal good faith, whatever that may be, who bring important values that are part of the rebuilding and the healing. I think of the values of shared across faith communities and I guess people of no faith that value principles like humility and repentance or change, the ability to say, I'm going to do better than I have done, care for the vulnerable, that those principles can inform the way forward and light the footsteps of a better path. And so I think about something from in his letter from Birmingham jail. Dr. Martin Luther King basically was calling others. He was specifically, the letter was addressed to other ministers, right? And he was calling them to the cause because they had been criticizing him. And he asked them to become co-workers with God in helping to make life better for those most vulnerable. And I've always aspired to that designation. And I can sense that the gathering here that you do as well, to those shared values that have been preserved in Indigenous culture and that are touted in your faith traditions. I think making those real in the lives of our brothers and sisters is a noble aspiration.
Thank you. Yes, and in solidarity and allyship, I think are big things that came out today in brotherhood and sisterhood, and and calling us all to that cause. Janos, you started us off. Please, can you wrap us up?
I just wanted to say how much I appreciate everybody's perspective. There's just so much to cover. I think we didn't even barely scratch the surface. But one thing I really see as a hopeful light is just the fact that people are willing to learn from people of other faiths, other backgrounds, of other cultures. And I think that's going to be the key. It's consistent cultural education, sharing those tidbits of our religions, our ways of being that are similar as opposed to different. I think we as humans sometimes dwell on difference more than we should. We're all human. We're all intelligent, and we all were put here for a reason. However you think that came to be, we are here. We are here. And that is amazing. Just to be a human being on this planet at the same time as somebody else is amazing. So I look forward to seeing people unite, because it is true. I've seen a lot more uniting across causes to fight for human rights, for dignity, for cultural awareness. And in my context, I am all about cultural sovereignty. I truly believe for our young people who are lost and committing suicide at extremely high rates, they need to feel loved. They need to feel validated. And one way to do that for our youth is to give them their culture and their language back. It was taken from them they might not have even known how important it was to the people. And they might not even understand now, but they're missing something. And you can see that they're struggling. So I truly believe that tying all that together will be a great step in the right direction.
There's nothing more I can say that's more powerful than that to close it out. I hope our speakers today heard from all of us the love and the validation from all of our communities to yours. We hear you. You said we are here. I think that came up and resonated a lot today, that we shouldn't be here, but we are here. And so let's continue to support one another. We are here. Let's move forward, and peace upon all of you. And Cole, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to jump in to say, but if not, we are at the end of our time.
Christine, could I just say, oh,
Absolutely.
Cole, after you.
So again, just thanks to everyone for participating, for all the work that's been done behind the scenes, for the thoughtful commentaries, for those who have been working on trying to encapsulate some of this in social media posts that you can watch for. Thanks to everyone for the hard work and the meaningful contributions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, cool. I just wanted to add thanks to James Christie, because he was the one who really the engine that brought us all together. So I'm deeply grateful because he knows all and brought most of the speakers, panelists. So I just wanted to acknowledge how gracious and great he was with all of us throughout the whole process. Thank you very much, Jim.
So no one wants to leave. I think everyone wants to hang around, but we do invite you to continue the conversation through the Interfaith G20. You've all registered through that website in case you need it again. I know I should have it at the tip of my tongue. If someone else wants to jump.
It's g20interfaith.org. So we welcome, and we'll keep those who have been here on our list for other events going forward, and we welcome collaboration.
Yes, please get involved. There's a lot of webinars, working groups, and spaces for coming together. And so we hope you join us on this journey.